we're now back into the final session before we take a half-hour break for lunch. This next session is about keeping children safe in education, and it's going to be delivered by Paul. You don't need to introduce yourself. I think most people know you.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon now, isn't it? Just checking the clock. Good afternoon, colleagues. I take it a lot of you are feeling revitalised and refreshed following the previous session. So I'm just going to go through the keeping children safe in education advice and guidance and how that applies to supply teachers, because as we talked about earlier this morning, in my roundup of what we've been doing, there are issues and concerns about the way in which allegations are managed, and we certainly, for your part, would really welcome if there are situations where something's happened untoward, that we get the information and intelligence, because we need this information to share with colleagues who we engage with in terms of addressing this and taking the matter forward. So I will be sharing my screen. So I think everybody can see that. So as Wayne alluded to, talking about allegations that are made against supply teachers, and mainly talking about the situation in England, because there is a very important piece of statutory information that all schools, colleges must abide by, which is keeping children safe in education. And I think it's important to start this conversation by saying we are aware it's a very small minority, just like it's a small minority in the wider teaching profession. There are a very, very small minority of supply teachers who may, for whatever reason, find themselves in a situation where a concern or allegation is raised whilst undertaking work in a school or college. So it's about looking at that and how that is dealt with and ensuring that it's dealt with in a satisfactory way that ensures our members, when anything's raised, are protected. And to that extent, the important thing is to understand the backdrop to this, which is keeping children safe in education, sometimes referred to as KCSIE by some people. It is statutory guidance. So it's important to understand that, because there isn't much in the way of what we would describe as statutory guidance that's issued by or has been issued by the Department for Education under the previous government. But this is one of few statutory instruments or documents. So all schools, colleges, etc. are obliged to follow this, irrespective of whether they're an academy chain, irrespective of whether they're a free school. They must comply with this. And in the KCSIE, it sets out what their legal duties are. So it's all about safeguarding and the welfare of children under the age of 18. And it addresses how that should be managed. And it makes it clear that all schools and colleges should have processes and procedures in place that enable them to manage effectively any issue, safeguarding concern or allegation, no matter how small, regarding a staff member. Now, when they say staff members, they take a very broad view, and that includes supply staff, volunteers and contractors. So it's very, very important that schools have procedures in place. So this is getting to the heart of the matter already in relation to some supply teachers, because obviously if you're employed by an agency and or an umbrella company, then how is this managed? Well, KCSIE makes it clear. It doesn't matter how you're employed, who is your employer, the school or the trust or the local authority has an obligation to have in place an effective mechanism to manage that. So the latest version of this obviously came into effect 2023. They may tweak and tinker with it for 2024. But my understanding from colleagues in conversations is that none of this is substantially changed, and the government is not looking to change it currently. So they often have to undertake a consultation process when they look to make significant changes. So the idea is that the current version is just rolling forwards. And if you're interested in identifying where the relevant paragraphs are, paragraphs 71 to 73 are the paragraphs where it talks about this, as well as paragraphs 151 to 152 of KCSIE. One of the significant areas and one of the most substantive areas, which details very in minutiae, is part 4. Part 4 of KCSIE is the area where it outlines how things should be dealt with. And it does talk again about the specifics regarding supply teachers. It clarifies that the situation for the overwhelming majority of our supply teacher members, and it does go further by talking about those who are not employed by the placement school. So they've been understanding clearly if you're employed directly by the school, or if it's a local authority school and you're employed through local authority pooled supply, there seems to be greater clarity around how that's managed. But if you're not, and you're employed through an agency and or umbrella company, then this is explicitly detailing how all of those situations, including those where you're not employed by the school, are managed. And it's not, by the way, when you look at the language and the use of language, this isn't a case of how schools may manage this. This is not a case where a school can cherry pick which aspects of this document it adheres to and which it chooses to ignore. The whole document must be taken into account, and it says should be managed. This is not giving schools an option, but it also says how schools and employment businesses. So this is actually saying it's not just the school's responsibility. There is an onus on the employment business, the agency and or umbrella company, and umbrella companies are captured by this as well, to manage the situation. And really the argument is they should be working in some level of tandem operation, both together. Now, it's important to understand, because I know we've had this argument. The argument's been, well, the person was only there for a day, 2 days. It's not a long-term assignment. Move along, nothing to see here. That is not the case. KCSIE does not make any distinction between the length of an assignment so whether it's ad hoc, day here, day there, or longer term assignments such as those in excess of a term. KCSIE does not make any such distinction. So in essence, KCSIE is saying, should a supply teacher have an allegation or concern raised on a day assignment, the school should still undertake its obligations working with the employment business in line with keeping children safe in education. There's no sort of distinction. There's no sort of, it's a day assignment, an allegation's raised, don't bother, just brush it under the carpet and move along. That's not what KCSIE says. Okay, so if we get into the specific paragraphs, I think it is important to understand the specific paragraphs, because these are the paragraphs that you may or somebody may need to use, and throw back at people should a situation occur or arise. And hopefully, as I said at the start, this is for the very small minority of our supply teacher members. The vast and overwhelming majority quite clearly go about their day, undertake their work and do it, and there's no issue raised. But where there are issues raised, then obviously it's important to understand the relevant paragraphs. So paragraph 374 makes it clear. In some circumstances, schools and colleges will have to consider an allegation against an individual not directly employed by them, where its disciplinary procedures do not fully apply because agencies will have their own policies and procedures. For example, supply teachers or contracted staff provided by an employment agency or business. In paragraph 375, I've highlighted in red the key points you need to take away. In no circumstances should a school or college decide to cease without finding the facts or liaising with the local authority designated officer or LADO. So again, there should be, and we know through the experiences that you've provided us with as supply teachers, the evidence you've provided, we know there are situations where supply teachers get dumped. They're dropped, they're not asked back, the assignment's terminated. KCSIE is very clear. There are no circumstances where that is acceptable without finding out the facts. And obviously, finding out the facts is, meets thresholds in terms of investigating, gathering evidence. It's not simply somebody said something, we don't want you back. Well, what do the facts say? Because you're then making an assumption about a supply teacher, which may be entirely inaccurate, misleading, and misconstrued. Okay, so governing bodies have an obligation to discuss with the supply agency or agencies where the supply teacher works, whether it's appropriate to suspend the supply teacher or redeploy whilst carrying out the investigation. So it's important to understand there should be a process where if an allegation is raised, it's not the case the assignment is terminated. It should be consider the options, and only probably in a serious matter where there's no alternative, then that might be the case. But you need to make an assessment to consider whether it is or is not serious enough to meet that threshold. So there should be something going on. So again, it is detailed, apologies, but it is quite lengthy, but it's about giving you the information to help and assist you in understanding how this operates. Okay, so we know, because experience and information and evidence provided by you supply teacher members suggests that basically schools and colleges don't bother to take the lead. They basically rub their hands of it and pass it to the agency. It does make it clear in KCSIE the school or college will usually take the lead. And the reason for that is, and the reason we would argue this is helpful, is because schools will have access to all the information. They can get statements from children, they can get statements from other members of staff. The agency is not in a position to be able to do that. And the only way the facts are of the matter and any investigation can be establishing the facts of an allegation is by gathering the information, all the relevant information, So the school is best placed. So agencies may be involved in this, but the school is best placed to lead the investigation. Now, the reason why we would like that to be the case is because in most school policies, and I've yet to see one that doesn't do this, if a school is dealing with this through the relevant safeguarding policy, or the school deals with it through the relevant disciplinary policy, those policies will enable there to be trade union representation. And in fact, if you look later on in red, it says in KCSIE, they should be advised to contact their trade union representative if they have one, or a colleague for support. Further emphasizing the need to contact trade unions, but also, as I said, in policies we see, they would be the right to trade union representation, and the supply teacher could therefore invoke that right and bring a trade union rep to any meeting that takes place under any relevant procedure. Okay, so it does understand that supply teachers are not, employed by the school. It does recognise that whilst they're there, they are working under the supervision, direction, and control of that school or the governing body. Okay, and therefore the school is better placed to take the lead. The agency is helpful in assisting and managing that, but it should be the schools that take the lead. And obviously, when schools and colleges do take the lead, they should inform the agency of the process they have. Okay, but also doing that, account and understand what the agency's policy is. Okay, including if the agency is obliged to refer it to DBS, or they're obliged to remove the person or individual under the conduct regs, and we'll talk about that a bit later on as well. Okay, so it is clearly saying the school should take the lead, but keep the agency informed. And so again, we then get into territory where schools cannot dismiss this, brush it under the carpet, and move on, say it's not their responsibility because they're not a permanently employed member of staff. The onus falls more heavily on the school to undertake a process. So schools and college leaders, they all should be aware of this and be cognizant of this and the importance of abiding by this. Yeah, KCSIE, as stated at the beginning, is a statutory document, and as such, there is no circumstances where those paragraphs we've referenced should not be followed by both the school and or employment agency. If there are, as stated at the beginning, the union wants to know, because we are looking to rattle the cage on this, because we know, where supply teachers get told, oh, an allegation has been made. Some agencies have basically said, we can't supply you anywhere anymore, and then they lose their work. And if they're in an area where that agency dominates, then what other alternative options have they got for work? So we do know this is a significant concern. In some minority of cases, it can be a significant concern. So we need to make sure we're taking this message forward, and we need to make sure we're gathering evidence that we can present to the DfE that says this is unfair and it's not working. Let's have a look at how we can do this better. And let's report those cases. Let's report them and say, well, this is a school and or agency that's not abiding by this. What are we going to do about it? So as stated, it would not be acceptable, therefore, under the provisions of KCSIE, the statutory provisions, it would not be acceptable for a school or college to cancel an assignment when an allegation is raised without undertaking some form of investigation. And the same would apply to an employment agency who no longer supplies a supply teacher, including for further placement, if an allegation or concern is raised. So if it's decided that the circumstances suggest that supply teachers should either be suspended or redeployed, then the NASUWT does maintain that the supply teacher should be treated no differently to other teachers working in the school or college. And obviously, as such, they should be afforded the same level of protection, which would include the right to trade union representation at any meeting that's held to discuss redeployment or that's held when investigating the situation. Okay. And obviously, as we said, the KCSIE advice does say supply teachers should contact their trade union as soon as possible. So to reinforce this point, KCSIE makes it clear that schools are best placed to undertake the investigation. So it doesn't seem appropriate for the employment agency to undertake its own process without recourse to KCSIE, particularly if it's not got a policy or procedure in regard to this. And we do know, and we come across many agencies that do not have some basic policies. So if the school isn't undertaking this, then the argument becomes, where is the agency? Well, if neither are undertaking any obligation, any investigation, any assessment based on the evidence and the facts, collecting the information to reach a judgment about where to go, then quite clearly there is an argument they are in breach of the current provisions around this, because they should be doing that. So if a school says it's the agency's obligation, the agency says the school should be doing it, well, obviously, either one or both should be doing it. And if neither are doing it and they're patching it off on the other, then that is not satisfactory. That's unacceptable. And the union would want to be notified in that situation. KCSIE also, the most recent version of it, talks about something called low-level concerns. Concerns that aren't significant enough to meet the threshold maybe to go to LADO, but concerns that may be enough to warrant some discussion around the issue that's raised. Okay, and KCSIE does expect there to be some system in place to manage that for supply teachers as well as any other member of staff. Okay, so all supply teacher members should be able to access that policy, and you should be able to familiarize yourself with it, because it's not about saying a supply teacher's had an allegation made against them. Well, what if a supply teacher also witnesses an allegation, some behavior that is inappropriate, untoward? They have an obligation under KCSIE to report a low-level concern. How would they know how to report such a low-level concern if they aren't aware of the policy, where it is, and provided with the idea, the information to be able to read and understand it? However, in situations where a supply teacher may be the subject of a low-level concern, appropriate action may need to be taken. But again, it does make it clear that there should be a low-level concerns policy, which allows for staff to be supported, to understand how to address any conduct and correct it. That does not, again, and this is fundamental here, KCSIE does not distinguish between a permanent employee, a governor, a volunteer, contractor, or supply teacher. So there can be no excuse of a school saying, I didn't discuss this with the supply teacher because they were only here for a day and they work for an agency, I don't employ them. That's not what KCSIE expects, because make no bones about this, this is about safeguarding children. It's about making sure the right protections are there so children can be in a safe environment. So schools should be dealing with low-level concerns. And if there is a low-level concern that has been raised about the behaviour of a supply teacher in a school, then the school should, through its policy, explain and address that concern with that individual. And it could just be you having a conversation as a male supply teacher in a classroom with a female pupil and you had the door closed. It's probably better to have the door open. It could be, remember, low-level concerns can be just something simple like that. It's just a bit of education, a bit of an educational piece, explain to the person, so it could apply equally to anybody in a school, not just a supply teacher, and it should be dealt with. So, and again, Part 3 of KCSIE makes it clear that schools and colleges should only provide substantiated safeguarding concerns allegations that meet the harm threshold in references. So if it meets the harm threshold, then it may be the case that this is something that's in a reference. It may be the case that this is something that's reported. It may be the case that this is something that's referenced potentially in a DBS check. But if it's not, then it should not be included in references. And we have really disappointingly seen some people talk about stuff and we know it's not substantiated. There is not substantial evidence to substantiate it, therefore it should not be in a reference. And again, if that's a situation anyone finds themselves in, they should contact the union as a sense of urgency. Okay. It states furthermore that low-level concerns should not be included in references unless they relate to issues that normally would be included in a reference. So unless it's misconduct or poor performance, it shouldn't be included in a reference. Yeah. And it goes on to further reinforce the point. Any repeated concerns or allegations which have all been found to be false, unfounded, unsubstantiated, or malicious should not be included in any reference. So even if there is some evidence which might support concerns, if there is not enough of that evidence to substantiate the allegations, that does not mean that it should be included in a reference. In fact, it makes it clear it shouldn't be. Yeah. So it's irrelevant if a school thinks an individual, including a supply teacher, did something wrong. If the school cannot substantiate that, that is not included in a reference. It's important to note, when we produced advice and guidance on this, the advice and guidance will be going on the website soon, we did seek out the view of the DfE. We've worked quite closely with officials on this and gone through various iterations. And their response to us was, they have confirmed this guidance is consistent with Keeping Children Safe in Education 2024. So basically, what we've written to some degree is endorsed by the DfE as being consistent with what they've said. So any school, college, or any agency, etc., that takes a different view, then obviously we need to know about that, because their view would clearly be inconsistent with that of the Department for Education. It is important to recognise as well, and this is where sometimes legislation coming from different angles and different departments doesn't always marry up, because KCSIE is very strong, but then you've got the conduct regs as well. So regulation of the conduct regs does require an agency to end supply where allegations made about a person suggest they are unsuitable. If it comes to light that it may, and that's the important word, make a supply teacher unsuitable, the agency is supposed to carry out inquiries and advise the hirer. Now, obviously, when you look at that in the round with KCSIE, which is the statutory document, that suggests the agency is obliged to carry out some level of investigation, liaise and advise and work with the school on this. So again, it's reinforcing this idea that schools and colleges cannot just dismiss things and move on and wash their hands of it. Why? Because you're working through an agency and you're a supply teacher working through an agency. So we really do want to hear from members if there are issues, concerns that are raised about this, because we are worried, and we have had recent experience where schools are not adhering to KCSIE. They're not following this. We want to name and shame those schools. We want to make it clear that this is unacceptable, because, as I said, ultimately, this is about safeguarding and protecting children and young people. If there are people who are up to no good, nobody wants them denigrating the profession. So if a school isn't doing this, then the school should be held accountable, because it could be putting children and young people in its care at risk. So we've been told very clearly by colleagues in the DfE, if as a supply teacher an allegation's raised, the school just dismisses it, rubs its hands of it. They want to know. They have in fact gone so far as to say they can make the school undertake an investigation. They can also challenge the agency about its behaviour in the process. And it is important to understand that agencies, some agencies particularly, are operating on the Crown Commercial Services portal, which essentially is a portal that schools can use to decide who they want to use for supply. So all these agencies are on there, and there are sorts of guidelines about how those agencies on the CCS should operate. And one of them is they are expected to follow KCSIE. That is an eligibility criteria for them to be on the portal. So if, say, an agency is not doing this, you know the name of that agency and you go onto the Crown Commercial Services portal and see them on there and they haven't done this, we can report that. And that will be looked at, because that is a condition of being on the portal. If, and I think this is important to understand, and I do appreciate entirely, if as a supply teacher, you're worried if you raise alarm bells, your future and what happens to you, then other avenues do exist. One of the other avenues is whistleblowing. So we can, as a union, and you can contact the union, we can look at whistleblowing as a possible option when there is a situation where this is not being taken seriously. And you're worried that you as a supply teacher, by raising the issue in the alarm bell, will encounter and suffer a detriment. So we can do that. And obviously under whistleblowing, whistleblowers have significant legal protection. So if you did do that, working through the union, you would have significantly more protection because of the protections provided in whistleblowing legislation. So that is it. I will stop sharing. I notice we have 2 questions. I've obviously been very good at my timing this morning, which is a benefit. So we have plenty of time for questions. I see there are 2 questions, Ray.
So one from Andrew Tessier. Paul, with the lack of feedback in supply, how would anyone know if they've been dropped or blacklisted? Not just in relation to this, but in any and every other area. I think it's just there is sometimes the school don't want you and you might not know the reason why, and it might have been an allegation.
Yeah, I mean that's true, Andrew. And I mean I appreciate we're never going to reach a situation where we've got a perfect system. What we're trying to do here is educate members about the fact there are protections in the KCSIE legislation. We don't think schools often and agencies combined adopt and adhere to that. But you are right. You know, if you don't get any feedback, how would you know that there is an allegation made against you? So it is a good question. I recognise that, and I recognise there's not a perfect system out there at the moment. Hopefully, we are moving towards a better system in place. But I recognise that. I recognise the lack of feedback. You know, just don't come back, or you just don't get provided for work. It's interesting to note that Matt from the TUC earlier on talked about issues around blacklisting. You know, how would you as a supply teacher know if you've effectively, as the phrase says, been blacklisted? We have made this point to colleagues in the TUC. We've made the point that supply teachers just often are dropped for work. They're not asked to go back. Effectively, they're blacklisted and they don't know why. So we have made that point, and hopefully moving forward in conversations with government, etc., on issues associated with blacklisting, this may feed into those conversations. But it's a really good point, Andrew, so thank you for making that.
Thank you, Paul. The next one from Deborah White. If a permanent teacher is suspended because of an allegation, they are still on full pay. Why do supply teachers lose their full pay without any recompense, especially where an allegation was found to be false?
Again, Deborah, that's a really good point. It's an issue we'd want to box off. I mean, the problem is there is that distinction in law. You're not a permanent member of staff. You are an agency worker, so you don't have that relationship with the school. You have that relationship with the agency. I do think it's a really good question. I couldn't agree more with you. If you're on a long-term assignment and you are suspended, then there is an argument, well, why can't you be paid whilst you are suspended? If it applies for a full-time member of staff, then why does it not apply for a supply teacher? I mean, I suppose there is the argument of when you've accomplished and achieved 12 weeks or more, then is this something that would be applicable under AWR? I think we need to make a case-by-case assessment. I think there could be an argument made that it would. There could also be counter-arguments to say, no, it's not. But yeah, it's a really good point, Deborah, and one that hasn't fallen on deaf ears in terms of the union in my listening to that.
Thanks again. The next one, Christina Johnson. Does everything you have just spoken about also apply to any teachers doing teaching assistant supply?
Yeah, KCSIE applies. It's a really important point. I hope I got across. KCSIE applies to anybody, irrespective of how they're employed in school. So, yeah, volunteer. So if you go to school doing voluntary reading, if an allegation is made against you, it should be investigated in the same way as if somebody's a permanent member of staff has their investigation managed. So that's my understanding of KCSIE. That's the view that I think the DfE takes, because again, this is a safeguarding issue. Why should safeguarding be done differently? You know, if we've got a volunteer, may do something, may decide they want to go into school for a very nefarious purpose, more so than the permanent member of staff. So clearly we want to manage that, and we want to manage it effectively. So the process is the process, and it should be managed according to the guidelines, the statutory guidelines, and I don't think it distinguishes between different people.
Thank you. Next question from Shirley Husbands. Is there any mileage in retrospective reporting school/agencies who have not followed the protocols you've just outlined?
Yes, it's a very simple answer, Shirley. We want to know if people have had a really nasty experience, they think from what we've done today that KCSIE has not been applied in the way it should be. We want to know. I mean, send us the information. I've given people my email address at the beginning of the day. Send us the information. I'm not committing to anything further than than what we might be able to do. I can't overstretch, but the information is important intelligence. And if we gather more and more intelligence on this, then obviously next time KCSIE is revisited, and it will be eventually at some stage, and there'll be a consultation, the NASUWT can make the point very clearly and cogently, evidence-based, that this is not being followed. So more needs to be done. It's important to understand on that, by the way, that we led the way to some degree in getting all of the stuff we've discussed into KCSIE in the first place. Because years ago, we were raising this, saying, what happens when supply teachers have an allegation made against them? They just rub their hands, walk away. And so we were fundamental in getting some of this advice and guidance into the revised KCSIE document, because we've clearly made the point that was not satisfactory. So we've got to a better place. I'm not saying we're in the perfect place, but we're in a better place. And hopefully getting more intelligence will enable us to chip away at getting us more closer to a more perfect place going forwards.
Thanks, Paul. We do not have any more questions as yet. So I have just asked a message if Dave could start earlier. If we do finish for lunch any time now and still have half hour to see if Dave can start half an hour early. And they're just going to ask him, I would say 1:30 time if you can hear me. But if not, I'm not quite sure how I would get to speak to him because I'm assuming you're just going to go off for this half hour rather than stay online. If there
I
is
can
any more
certainly-
questions, quickly. Come on, Paul.
I was just going to say I can try and contact Dave and see if he will come in earlier. So what are you saying, Chair? We finish now and he comes in at half.
Yeah, I'm sure he will. 15 minutes. It'll be better for him and it'll be better for us to finish. And then we finish the day earlier. So I'm going to say 1:30. We'll finish now, have an earlier lunch, and we'll still have the half hour. Oh, very quickly, Tindy, when our supply teacher's going to have a regional pay rise and when is it going to start up on an annual basis? I can answer that, Tindy. It's something we're speaking to the government about regarding better contract and conditions for supply teachers. Reasonable pay rise, it's down to individual supply agencies and what you can negotiate with them at the moment, but we're hoping that might change in the future. So I'm going to close that now and we'll come back at 1:30. It's okay for everybody, and then we do finish a bit earlier. So enjoy your half an hour break. See you at 1:30.